The lovely introduction, I teach at the School of Law and Justice. I'm the program convener for criminology. The main course that I teach is criminal justice in practice. It was not a course I was excited to teach, I'll be honest with you, but it has become a course that I love to teach because we essentially start with animal trials and witch hunts and move all the way through to the fabrics that can record audio. So we do this really big journey through the criminal justice system, and the era that really interests me is the Victorian era, and that's what this research project focuses on. So sort of the big ideas that I'm interested in and that I want to share with you today focus on gender and motherhood. And this is I guess what would be considered a micro history. So I'm focused on 10 years and sort of 3 women that lived in Gladstone prison, Gladstone jail. So Gladstone jail is in South Australia. I live in New South Wales, so it is a different state. You have to take a bit of an airplane ride to get there. And I was really interested when I was looking at the primary source material about the relationship that was evident between these 2 prison matrons and a woman that had been convicted of murder and served essentially 10 years at Gladstone jail. And that's why I selected that sort of window, that 10-year period, because it roughly corresponds with her sentence that she served, and it also roughly corresponds with the first 10 years that jail was operational. So it really was the woman that was convicted of murder that initially captured my attention. Her name was Elizabeth McGree. I'm going to give you a bit more information about her later in the presentation. But she has a unique place in Australian legal history because she was, I believe, the second woman ever to plead the belly and have her capital offense sort of converted and have a stay of execution because she was pregnant. And she gave birth in prison. The 2 matrons that oversaw her had a similar number of children that Elizabeth did. And really, I think significantly, their children were experiencing illnesses at the same time in the prison and getting care from the same sort of what we would say service provider medical staff at the time. So they were birthing in prison, they were having the same illnesses, struggling to care for sick children, and they were also experiencing the loss of children, either through death or through having children removed and sent to the destitute asylum, and then sometimes death occurring after that removal. So these were shared experiences that appeared in different ways in the primary text, but there were also significant aspects of their life that were obviously profoundly different. But it was through these matrons' diaries that I then paired with the logs of they were called the surgeon's logs or the medical officer logs, and then primary source material through newspapers and government documents, that this really interesting picture emerged about like birth and illness and motherhood and death, all within these prison walls. And in Australia, there isn't very much written about women, especially these women that were sort of at the forefront of working in the criminal justice system, as well as women that were moving through the criminal justice system as offenders. And I became quite hopeful that I could sort of bring those experiences together in some way and explore them to sort of see how it relates to these ideas of motherhood in prison settings. So again, this is early research. I was really fortunate that this year I received a small fellowship from the History Council of South Australia, so I could go and visit the state library and the state records. The state library was a really wonderful source to understand how people were, especially benevolent societies, were thinking about how to support women that were maybe destitute, coming out of either a workhouse or coming out of a jail sentence, what programs were in place to support them. It was also really helpful to understand what the economic situation of the state was in the different regions. But most of the most crucial material came from the state records of South Australia. So these were the matrons' diaries, the surgeons' diaries, as well as the arrest records and admission logs. In Australia, we have a resource called Trove, which is run by the National Library of Australia, which has digitized newspapers and government documents and images. And I was really fortunate because I had 2 final year criminology students. We do something called work integrated learning, which is essentially a placement course. And these 2 students, because of some of the supports that they needed, couldn't go out and do an external placement. So I brought them into this project and said, look, if you're interested in learning how to do archival research, you can work with me on this and to develop timelines and find these different resources and make family trees. And they both really, really loved it. They didn't sort of know, we don't have a historic criminology course. So they hadn't taken that other course from me. So they didn't really know that this was something that they could do. And just by chance, they'd both taken a lot of history courses as an interest. So this was a really wonderful opportunity for them to learn about different ways of approaching criminology and its study. So this year, I do hope to go and visit Gladstone Jail. I haven't been there yet. It is in a rural town in South Australia. It's about 200 kilometers north of the capital of Adelaide. It is very much an agricultural-based community. It was built, the town was essentially built to service the railway. When they built this prison, and it is a big, they built this jail, and it's a big jail. The population there was less than 1,000 people. So this is the 1879. Today, I think there's less than 700 people. So it never really bloomed and blossomed into a large town. But they built this prison with the idea that it would be almost a catchment for all the mining communities, agricultural communities, and overflow from Adelaide Jail as well. So we do see prisoners being transferred quite a bit. There was one quite complex case that led to an inquiry because there was a pregnant woman that was transferred very late in her pregnancy, and it led to adverse outcomes. So there was an inquiry regarding that. The idea was that this would initially house about 60 inmates, 32 convicted men, 13 women, 13 people on remand, and then have a debtors unit as well. They wanted to expand to 500, but this never occurred. It was built over sort of a 3-year period, and the organization that was responsible for building it actually went to the UK and worked with different prison governors there to create a plan. They were very concerned about having drainage, improved ventilation. The cells that they built were 7 foot by 11 foot, which was bigger than what was happening in Australia at the time. One of the Victorian era lockups that I've done some research in relation to, the rooms there were 7 foot by 4 foot, which was considered a temporary lockup, but people did stay there for months at a time while they were waiting to go to court. And this was a bit unusual as well because they did design it with a separate wing for females and a separate facility for matrons on site that didn't always occur. So it was quite ahead of its time, thinking about keeping men and women in separate places, designing to have a female matron that could live on site, trying to ensure that there was adequate ventilation. Certainly, though, there were other things that were not what we would consider being as quite as progressive. Solitary confinement was sort of the go-to punishment, and they had what they considered a light and a dark solitary confinement, depending on how much light you had access to. So it was designed so that a keeper could live there and a matron could live separately. As for the period that I looked at, the matron was always married to the keeper, so that sort of separate wing was not used by the matron. She lived with the keeper and the keeper's family. And this was quite similar to what we see with police matrons in Australia, where the matron is sort of an extension of the husband. The matrons that were working at Gladstone jail were paid, and most police matrons in the 1880s were not being paid at all. It was just sort of expected that they would do that work for free. So the fact that they were paid, that there were steps being taken to incorporate them into the physical design of jails is quite unique. So Gladstone was a unique building for its era. So the key source, as I mentioned, were the diaries that were kept by these two different matrons. We have Henrietta and Agnes. Both of them had worked at the same jail previously as at different time periods. This was Redruth Jail. So they were employed there as well. They were paid employees, and their husband was the keeper at that. So they sort of cycled through. Henrietta was at Redruth. She moved to Gladstone, and Agnes came in and took her job. Redruth was a very small jail. I've looked at their diaries from that period, often only sort of one or two women at a time, very informal. Even the way that they kept their logbooks were very informal. And often the women that were in that smaller jail, they were actively involved in the matron's household, helping her tend to children, helping her do laundry, those types of tasks. And this was especially true when the inmate was younger. So if she was considered too young for hard labor, she would come into the matron's home and assist her with the children. Gladstone was a much bigger facility. Normally, there was anywhere from, especially in the 1880s, from 6 to 13 inmates, female inmates at any given time. And their logs were very different in Gladstone. They were much more structured, much more formalized, almost pro forma. So both of these matrons were living in similar communities. They were both married to keepers. They were both sort of following their husband's employment journey. There's no evidence that Henrietta applied for a job as matron and her husband followed her. That just was not the reality of the time. So both of these women gave birth to children when they were working at these different jails. Henrietta had 2 children when she was living at Gladstone. 2 of her 6, she lost 2 during that period as well. When she came to Gladstone prison, she brought with her a 4-month-old child. And Agnes, it was very similar. Her children were born when she was the matron at Redruth Jail. And when she moved to follow her husband to Gladstone, she brought with her youngest child, who was 1 year old. So they both kept diaries, and this is a small excerpt from them, and it gives you a really good idea of what the day sort of looked like for these women. So you can see here they've set out, this is the 3rd of March, 1882. 6 female prisoners in jail employed ironing and sewing, work finished, 2 dozen and 2 articles ironed for Mrs. Gonar. Something about a visit, and then her signature and her title as matron. So this is Henrietta. So these diaries, everyone, there was some variation in them, but they were quite consistent. We have the number of inmates and we have the tasks. And they're very, very concerned with skill development. And that skill development is laundry, sewing. And I know that when I first looked at this, my instinct was that these were like low value skills to be teaching. And for myself, I was like, how is this going to address some of the reasons that we see these women were coming into the prison, which was vagrancy and theft, or being arrested because you didn't have means to support yourself. The matrons, they noted that they went out into the community to get these sort of consignments of fabric so that women could sew clothes, or have put an order in for booties and all of these other things. And I neglected to consider just how valuable clothes were in this period. This is sort of pre-sewing machines, where clothes in Australia were frequently stolen, not for people to wear, but because they could use them as currency. It wasn't as if they even needed to sell them to get currency. Like, clothes were so valuable, they could just be a currency in themselves. And when I looked at the documents from the Benevolent Society, yes, they were highly gendered in terms of how they were supporting women, but they documented pretty clearly that if they could provide women with like a clothes wringer, she could transition and start to support herself and have that sort of autonomy in her life. So there were skills that they were trying to cultivate, in these women, to hopefully mean they could go out and have a small business or have some power and control over their own finances. Now, the diaries also noted concerns about what was happening in the broader community and what that would mean for their ability to cultivate skills for inmates. Droughts, recessions, both of these meant that people wouldn't send clothes in for washing, wouldn't order clothes to be made for them. Recessions as well. There was also concern about sewing machines, that they were becoming more and more affordable, that women were sewing their own clothes rather than sending out to have them sewn in the prison. And there was some notes that there was lace making occurring in the prison. It wasn't clear from the notes, so whether lace making was a skill that women brought in with them, or something that was being taught. And lace making could be quite a valuable cottage industry during this time. Most of my notes, though, for these diaries were boring, tedious, repetitive. And I think, reflecting on it now, I think that was really reflecting the ideas of the time, like what people should be doing in this institution. It's that contemplating your sins. It's cultivating cleanliness, that spiritual and physical, cleaning clothes, praying, repenting, all of these things, and being industrious. That was a big part of the morality that was driving some of this skill development. So it was practical, but there was this other moral dimension that comes through. Obviously, there were church services that occurred. Many of the inmates were Roman Catholic. They had both Roman Catholic and Protestant services, sort of on alternating Sundays. These were not always well attended. I couldn't find any evidence from any of the notes that anyone was ever forced to attend these services. Now, this wasn't, I do want to make sure that I don't sound too, starry-eyed with the making lace and sewing clothes and developing skills to be self-sufficient. I mean, there's a lot of frustrations coming through in the matrons' diaries. Inmates are fighting with each other. There's physical fights, there's verbal fights. And this is further complicated because matrons were not empowered to make any decisions about punishment. They could not, solitary confinement was sort of the default. They couldn't say, hey, you punched you punched this other inmate, you need to go to solitary confinement for a week. They always had to wait for the male keeper or a justice, or even the male medical officer to speak into the situation, essentially tell them what could be done in relation to discipline. There was, again, solitary confinement. This was a very common punishment. Normally it was for multiple days. The medical officer would check in on the inmates, but this would have been a very, very rough form of punishment. Another sort of offense where morality is very clear was when women would try to communicate with the male inmates. This was something the matrons were very, very concerned about. And they would immediately report this to the keeper. They definitely wanted women put in solitary confinement for this. So they were, that concern about the women's morality is coming through with how that offense was punished. And there was another incident where a woman had smuggled in what was described as sort of like a contraband type of thing. It was a hair dye. She wanted to be able to dye her hair and sort of keep up appearances while she was in prison. And this was another offense that the matrons were very concerned about, not only because she had something that she wasn't supposed to have, but they were concerned that this reflected vanity. And that was not what they were trying to cultivate in this setting. So we have these daily tasks being chronicled, these sort of tensions that emerge when inmates are not behaving the way that the matrons are hoping that they will behave. But a lot of what's chronicled in these diaries is about health, the health of inmates. So there's chronic illnesses in a lot of these women. Some of these women have disabilities. They've been sentenced to hard labor, and the matron's trying to figure out how they can perform this labor when they have a physical disability. There's also significant mental health coming through, and poverty, of course, is underpinning all of this. And some of these women, they served their time and they were supposed to be released, and they did not have anywhere to go. And some of them stayed for days and weeks while they tried to figure out where they could go from there. I did want to note that there was a death of natural causes in an elderly inmate during this period, and matron Henrietta, she chronicled it in very, very great detail in her book, and she sat through the nights with them. What was interesting to me was that there was an inquest. Whenever there's a death in custody, there needs to be an inquest, and the matron, of course, was not allowed to testify at all at this inquest. Rather, the medical officer and the keeper did. They referred to her and mentioned that she was there, and mentioned that she has a record of it. But even though she was the primary person there, she was not permitted to speak at the inquest. So the matron's logs, their diaries, there was a lot of information there. But I also started to notice that there were these curious omissions or gaps in their diaries. Children weren't really mentioned at all. And if they did, it was sort of like something that had come at the end of a pretty serious matter, or an offhanded sentence. And I'd think to myself, oh, Kennedy had a child in there. And then I'd sort of go back and think, okay, they've been in here for 6 months and the matrons never mentioned that they had a child. And because they weren't mentioned, when I first started going through these diaries, I thought that there just weren't that many children in prison with their mothers. They weren't included in the intake logs where they noted why people were being incarcerated. They weren't noted on the logs when people left prison either. They weren't counted on that daily tally that sort of went in every single entry in both of the logbooks. And some of the smaller jails that I've looked at in South Australia, the matrons did record the number of children. So it was a little bit odd when I was looking at this, because I thought, where are the children? Why aren't there any children here? Because it seems like there should be more. There were births that were recorded, there were miscarriages that were recorded, and there were also notes when a mother had been mistreating a child. And I'll talk about that a bit more later. But I wanted to quantify how many women were going through this with small children with them. And I realized that the matron's log was never going to give me that information. So I went to the surgeon's log, or the medical officer, because whenever someone was admitted with an infant, they were seen within a day or two. And with this resource, I could figure out how many of these women had children with them at any given time, and an idea of their health. So as I mentioned, Gladstone had capacity for 13 female inmates. For much of the 1880s, it was pretty much at capacity. And across that 10-year period, anywhere from, on any given day, 25 to 50% of women had infants with them. So these were children under 2 that were theoretically still breastfeeding. Some of the infants were noted that they were healthy on arrival. Most were unwell, or they got sick shortly after they got into jail. The treatments were frequently to address malnutrition, anemia, and ensuring that the baby was warm enough. So the things that were prescribed were nutritious food, bedding, flannel, so that they could sew clothes or blankets, milk, eggs. There was immunizations that occurred there as well. Some of the diseases were named, but they didn't have treatments at that time. So tuberculosis was pretty widespread. Syphilis, the woman that gave birth in prison had syphilis, and it appeared her baby was also born with syphilis. Diarrhea was a constant threat. And whooping cough as well. So I was able to find in the surgeon's logs how many of these women were caring for children while they were also sewing clothes and doing laundry and whitewashing cells and all these other things. But there were other gaps as well in the matron's logs, and that wasn't an absence in log entries, but a marked change. So if I was looking at a full year, I mean, you might have a full year of really detailed entries talking about their frustrations, their concern, trying to find more sewing for the women, trying to address an unruly inmate. But then there would be months where there's just sort of 2 lines, number of inmates, some sewing, all fine. And I thought, what's happened here? And it was when I started looking in the surgeon's logbook that I saw that it was like the missing piece of the puzzle, because it became clear why there were weeks and months in the matron's diaries that were so perfunctory. So for example, in May 1890, Matron MacDonald gave birth to a daughter while living and working at Gladstone Jail. She makes no note of this at all in her own diaries about the tasks and what's happening, aside from a note the month before that because so many people were ill with influenza, she needed to provide extra help at the jail. And then the month that she gave birth, she just notes, I was feeling unwell and unable to attend to duties for some days. So over the years, the matron's children they're getting sick. They're infected by the same things that the children of the inmates are infected with as well. And it was interesting that the matrons never really noted this. Occasionally they would note that the whole family was ill, and it made it hard to do their job, but there was no conversation about individual children or giving birth or any of those things. Now, there was one child that did factor a lot in the matron's log, and that was a baby of one of the inmates. That was James McKee. So as I mentioned at the beginning, this project sort of started because of Elizabeth McGree, and it was because the way that the matrons spoke about her in their diaries. There's quite a bit of cycling of inmates, so many of them would come for a month. They might cycle back through a few times. Some would stay for a year and then never come back. But Elizabeth was there for a long time. She was there for 10 years. And there was one other woman who I'm still doing the background research on that served a similar sentence. So Elizabeth, she had her youngest child, James, when she was incarcerated. And at that time, she already had 8 children. She was convicted of murder of a murder that took place on November 12th, 1882. At the time of the murder, she had an infant as well. So she essentially had 20 years of mothering by the time she was incarcerated. And it would have been really rough and ready living. Her family seemed to follow the railway. At one point, her husband had a deed of land, but that was lost. And by 1882, they're essentially squatting, maybe renting a one-room shack without a floor and only a curtain to sort of provide some privacy. On November 12th, her husband is drinking. He brings a drinking buddy home that is notoriously violent. Her husband passes out. She's sleeping in the little front room with her children, including the infant that she's nursing on the couch. The man comes back and starts attempting to sexually assault her and threatening to kill her. He has a knife. She calls to her 13-year-old daughter to take the baby. And her other son who's 13, comes and hits the man in the back of the head with a hammer. The man that's attacking her stumbles out of the house. She proceeds to stab him and he dies. She sends a child to go and get the police. The police don't really hurry because this is a house where violence is common, either with this particular man that has attacked her or between husband and wife. So her husband had quite an extensive history of violence, stalking and assaulting a woman before he married Elizabeth. And during the hearing, this pattern of violence came up a lot. Now, Elizabeth, she did drink alcohol, and this came up in the trial, that this was evidence that she had poor moral character. She was very poor, living in poverty as well. And she had also, when the police first arrived, she'd fabricated a story where she said that man came to the house, but then some stranger came and killed him. She's largely illiterate. This would have been a tremendously stressful event. And when she got to court, she provided a timeline that aligned with the forensic evidence. But at this point, she did not look like she was a good woman, essentially, and she was convicted of murder and sentenced to hang. So she pled the belly. She said that she was pregnant. So they brought in a jury of matrons, and they determined that not only was she pregnant, but she was quick with child, so she could not possibly be executed. This was only the second time that a jury of matrons was used in Australia. The first instance was almost 100 years later. In that case, the forewoman famously said, who was 60 years old, she said, "Gentlemen, she's as much with child as I am." Now, in that case, of Ann Davis' case, she became the first woman to be hung in Australia, and her conviction was for stealing clothes. Elizabeth, on the other hand, 100 years later, she was very much pregnant, so she had that stay of execution. So her last child, James, he was born in Adelaide Jail, which was where the trial was held, was in Adelaide, and then transferred up to Gladstone Jail when her son was 2 months old. So the matrons noted frequently that her son was quite ill, that the surgeon came and said he did not think that her son James was going to survive. And when I looked at the surgeon's logs, he's seeing this young baby a lot. Again, this is not the only child in the jail, but this is the one that came up the most in the matron's records, and that may have been because Elizabeth was serving a longer sentence. Now her son does survive, and he reaches age 2. And at this point, the matron is somewhat obliged to petition for him to be moved into the destitute asylum. When her son is removed from her care, she becomes incredibly unwell. For months, she can't physically work. She doesn't want to get out of bed. And the first day that her son leaves, the surgeon comes because the matron said, look, she's really unwell. I'm concerned about her. And the surgeon comes and says, okay, we'll give her a couple days off. And when she doesn't recover, the matron calls him again and said, look, she's still really, really sick. And he says, look, nothing's wrong with her. She needs to get back to work. What's interesting to me is that the matron had so little power to make any decisions about inmates. They couldn't punish them. They couldn't really do very much at all. But she doesn't follow the doctor's instructions. She instead of having her go to work, she keeps her back and notes that she doesn't work for several more days, and that she also has another inmate go and sleep in the cell with her so that they can share a bed together. And 6 months later, when her son dies in custody, we see a similar deterioration. And then a year later, we see a similar deterioration again, where the surgeon comes and says, look, this is a nervous thing of the brain. She's not sick. Like, she's actually sort of, she just thinks that she's bad, but she's all right. And in all of these instances, the matrons who have all lost children at certain similar ages as well, sort of between 5 months and 2 years old. They don't follow what he has told her to do. They don't put her back out to work. Rather, they allow her to rest, and they again put another female inmate in there to sit and be with her. Now, I know that we have to be cautious about like projecting emotion onto people in history. But when I read this, I was really struck by the sense that there was kindness and empathy there. Now, that being said, this was not a sort of Shangri-La of sisterhood that was happening in the 1880s. The matrons had very little patience for some of the more difficult inmates who cycled in and out with children. And there were 2 instances where there were mothers that were abusive to their young children. One in particular, she had about a just under 2-year-old daughter that she brought with her to prison, to jail. She threatened to kill her daughter. She was pregnant. She was threatening to force a miscarriage as well. And the matrons were actively involved in removing that child from the inmate's care, even though she was younger than 2, and normally a 2-year-old would stay with their mother. When they removed that daughter, there was none of this sort of extra comfort being afforded. Another instance, there was an inmate with pretty significant mental health issues. They were having seizures, violent outbursts, very, very abusive to their child as well. And again, the matrons were involved in the removal of that. And this woman was also not treated like a mother that was mourning separation from her child. And I think that this reflects those ideas about being a good mother, a good woman, and what is available to you from an emotional perspective versus being a challenging mother that's not behaving properly, that isn't doing the right thing, and that sort of tier of treatment that can occur in these settings. So again, I'm still thinking through these ideas. I've been doing this over the past, I guess, eight months now, thinking about these women. And my next step, I'm quite interested in comparing the matrons' logs with the keepers' logs, not only because these were people that were married to each other and working in the same space, but I'm curious about sort of how professionalization was occurring as women were moving in and working in this space. And I think this might reveal an even more nuanced picture of what are the regimes of care and punishment and rehabilitation. How does that contrast between the male inmates and the female inmates over here at Gladstone Jail? And at about 1890, there was a huge drop off in the prison population, at least for the women. I haven't looked at the male population. So consistently, there was anywhere from 7 to 13 prisoners in the 1880s. And then by about 1890, we only see 1 or 2 women in there. And I'm not quite sure yet what happened. Was there a change in agriculture? Was it because the railway construction was finished? Or was it legal changes that happened? How vagrancy was being policed? How people were responding to not having the means to support themselves? And I think currently right now, what I've shared today is pretty descriptive, and I'm excited to have a conversation and think about how this study helps us understand women working and being involved in the criminal justice system, especially in these sort of masculine occupations and negotiating motherhood in prison. And I'm just about ready to open for questions, but I want to share that next year, the School of Law and Justice, we are actually going to retry Elizabeth McGree, and sort of see where a new trial would take us in terms of her case. Okay, I think that wraps it up.
Wow, thank you so much, Alice. This is such an exciting topic. Certainly the historicizing the questions about gender in the contemporary, at the very least, this kind of research enables us to give a longer view when we discuss the role of women in society. And certainly, especially within those professions that have been scrubbed clean of their presence, their historic presence. And I was struck by the idea of like the husband-wife combination. Certainly in caretaker roles, we see this a lot where the woman's fate or identity is bound and obscured by her husband's career. Yet we know that she would have played a major role in his career development and trajectory and longevity. But her performance is not necessarily credited in terms of the value that it added. So yes, I'm intrigued. There are so many questions. I've noted in the chat that there are quite a number of questions, so I don't want to obscure those. So I'll go straight to them. I noticed that Yasmin, though this was not a question, it had she talks about the idea that I'm always keen to learn about the types of research methods and data collection analysis fellow scholars use in their work. And Keir Malloy had said something similar in regards to the matrons logs. So I thought I would start off by asking for a commentary on the methodology in general, if that's okay.
Sure. I think that for how I approached it was I come from a qualitative research background. My training is in anthropology. And when I was writing my PhD supervisor told me, you have to stop writing the history chapter. We do not need 1,000 years of history here. Anyway, so most of my research is qualitative. I talk to people, I do interviews, and then I code it essentially. And I sort of approach these logs in a similar way, where I might read the whole diary and make some notes, and then go back through with the themes that came out and start trying to almost codify that in a way. And I tried really with this research, I tried really hard to keep my mind open because I think that with archival research, it's very easy to think, okay, I need this one resource, and if it's not there, like I'm stuck. And with the Matrons diaries, when I started this project, I was actually looking for police matrons diaries because they were so hidden under their husband, um, uh, you know, that I couldn't sort of see them at all. And then I ended up seeing these other ones by the matrons, and yeah, so just trying to follow all the threads and not close it off and be open to where the research might take me. And again, like how I probably look at themes is that same technique, like trying to look at as much of the data together as I can before deciding like what are the key themes that have emerged here.
Thank you for that. Guys, I'm going to go straight to the chat and hand over the commentary to you. So I note that Kara has written the first question. Kara, did you want to read your question for Alice?
Yeah, brilliant. That'd be great, Esme. And thank you so much, Alice, for a fascinating talk. I love your micro-history approach. Just the level of richness and detail here is just incredible. So thank you so much for that. And I probably put up my question a bit early because you kind of answered it along the way talking about the Elizabeth McGree case. But I was wondering, I suppose, to what extent do we see the individual like personalities of Henrietta and Agnes actually coming through those matrons' diaries, or do they become kind of like mindless drones of the system that they're working in? I think in a lot of works have maybe explored like prisoner agency and resistance, but I haven't read as much about like the perspective of matrons and whether they actually exhibited resistance to these institutionalized norms that obviously were not helping the detainees. So I was just really interested if you could comment further on that, if that's okay.
It's been a little bit tricky I've been trying very hard to sort of develop a fuller picture of their entire lives. And as I mentioned, like when I first started looking at the logs, I just thought this is boring and tedious, and like it just feels like so repetitive. There's no personality here at all. But there was, and it just took, you know, a while. And it was this interesting almost tension between being very, very professional and factual, and we're doing this systematically, and it's going to be organized with these passages. Like when Henrietta was caring for the woman that was passing away, I mean, it's pages and pages of her talking about her emotions and her feelings and how she, you know, wants to ensure that her passing has dignity. And so it's an odd contrast, and especially when they are getting taxed by home life, you know, having a baby kids that are sick, it goes back to that super professional. This is who was here. This is what we did. Like they're gone. I mean, anyone could have written that essentially, but there's a lot there where you can see them trying to do what they think is right. Sometimes it's, you know, obviously we live in a different era. So we look at it and we're like, okay, obviously this woman's traumatized. You need to give her some grace. but that wasn't the period. And I think that they were trying to do the best they could with the tools that they had. So yes, I think what really surprised me though was it in this, I'm only basing this on looking at, I think, 3 different prison sets of logs by matron. So a very small one at Redruth, Gladstone, which is like an in-between, and then the biggest prison is in Adelaide. And it's interesting because it seemed like the bigger the prison got, the more the matron disappeared. The Adelaide logs, there's very, very little emotion, conversations about how inmates are behaving. It's much more so-and-so's in solitary. There isn't, she hit someone, she snuck hair dye in, you know, any of that stuff that gives it that richness. But I have only read, I think, maybe 5 years of the Adelaide logs. So it could be that once I get a bigger sample, then their personalities will come through in that agency, because that's what started this whole thing for me, was seeing that they made a decision that was completely against what they were being told to do. And sort of until that point, what I didn't see that as much.
Excellent. Thank you. Chris, can I hand the floor over to you?
Yeah, thanks, Alice. That's really, really interesting. And actually, the question that I've got in the chat is one I think you just answered. Because what I'm really interested in the boring stuff. That's the stuff that I get really excited by, is kind of bureaucratic systems and how they get used and what they get used for and how they evolve. And there's this really interesting moment that you've been talking about how women become trusted actors in certain parts of that bureaucratic system, not necessarily in others. And so the question I asked was, maybe the fact that there's more personal stuff in the smaller jails might be because they're run more as face-to-face and informal. And then, of course, what you just talked about in terms of Adelaide as being where the matrons are only cogs in the machine. And so, but I think what this is really interesting about is it points to those times and places where the system can't depersonalize or dehumanize, when sort of empathy for fellow mothers or empathy for a dying inmate becomes something that the matrons then have they've got a role as doing that emotional labor, and B, they've also got the space to actually to write it up and valorize it. And I'm interested in that, the fact that one of the matrons, forgive me, I forget which one, was attending to the dying inmates, and there's actually a genre of prison cleric writings which is all about managing death and attempting, and particularly before executions, about how you manage death, generally of the unrepentant male, to make him repentant. So he goes to the gallows, and sometimes you have ideas about, is it the Catholic or the Protestant is going to be the person who they turn to at the final moment? And so you almost got this kind of secular feminine version of that process, and she's writing that up and she's putting that down as part of the written record of the prison, and I find that's so she's obviously doing a whole lot of stuff in terms of dealing with the children or whatever, but they're not writing about it because they're kind of liminal in a way that they can't really exist, so they don't. And then she's also doing this thing with death, and she's kind of writing herself a space, and she's a working mother. There's just so much going on. It's just yeah. So so I suppose I've got another question that's coming out of that, is any indication at all of what the matron's children are doing, where their days are spent? Are they within the perimeter or are they outside it? Is there a kind of space where the keeper, and is anyone working as servants in the keeper's house, or is anyone working as servant for the matron? So are these, is there a kind of complete separation, or are the households or pseudo households intertwined like that? I mean, anyway, sorry, that's just like a splurge, but I just really interested in the way in what's going on. It's just great. Thank you. Thanks for opening it up.
Yeah, no, I'm really I actually hadn't thought about what are those children doing in their daily life, because they do, I mean, they live there, but I need to go and visit the facility, and I'm still trying to find the original blueprints for it when they designed it, because I have commentary on it, but maybe on a blueprint they might even show this is sort of the family's garden space and this is the other zone. But even, I mean, I hadn't even thought to look up even school records and things like that, just to get an idea of what is that pace of everyday life for these women. Yeah, thank you. It's got me thinking. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Oh, you're still muted, Esme.
Sorry, I was muted there. It was bound to happen at least once. We have another question from Yasmin. Yasmin, did you want to jump in?
Sure can. I just can't put my video on. I'm in a bit of a public space. I was just really interested in how the jury of matrons were called for pleading the belly. And I wanted to know whether this jury of women were also called in with other women's issues, whatever those might be at the time, that like whether it had an impact on their sentence and whether they were only called in for women's issues or whether they were on the jury with men. Yeah.
So jury of matrons were an institution in the UK that sort of came over to Australia with colonization. In the UK, there's definitely a fair bit of evidence that they had a long history of use, I think at least 700 years, and it would be generally for female-related issues, certainly with a capital offense, determining if the woman was pregnant and if she was quick with child. The quickening was a key aspect of that. But I believe they were also called in for disputes about inheritance. If a husband had died, determining if they thought that the child's the fetal development aligned with his ability to be the father. So I think that they spoke into that space as well. So there were some cities in the UK that had a roster of matrons that they would call upon. I think that there's some going back to maybe the 1430s, where they codified who the matrons would be. Matrons tended to be women that had already had children. That was a big requirement. Needed to be quite respectable women as well. They didn't intermix with men. They also didn't decide guilt or innocence. So they were a civilian jury, but it related to sentencing rather than guilt or innocence. In Australia, I have found the composition of the jury of matrons that was impaneled for Elizabeth McGree's case. I've been able to track down a couple of the women. Most of them were married to men that were quite well regarded in the community. So again, that idea that they were trustworthy and reputable. There were some cases, though, that if women were in the courthouse on the day, they might get called. In the UK, I know they might get called to come and determine if the woman was with child. The jury of matrons was definitely all women, and when the stethoscope was developed, is that power for women to make that determination shifted from women to male doctors, essentially. And it's interesting looking at the newspapers, because I mean, sometimes the jury of matrons would get it wrong. There was also a lot of concern that women would be too sympathetic to other women and sort of say, oh yeah, they're pregnant, just let them go. So there was concern that the system would be abused. Like most of the evidence, at least coming out of the UK, doesn't seem to support that there was widespread abuse of this by matrons or even by women. There were quite a few women that would plead the belly, and the jury would say, no, she's definitely not pregnant. But this case in 1882 is sort of late for the jury of matrons. I know there were a couple in the UK after this, but really once that stethoscope was developed and the medical officers could say, look, we don't need to sort of disrobe this woman. The Victorians didn't really like the men touching the women that much, but this was sort of okay in this context because the idea was that it was more effective than the jury of matrons. I might have wandered off on a tangent. Did that answer the question?
Yes, and I'm so sorry, my internet dropped halfway through that. But at least we have the recording, so I can catch up on that. But yeah, from what I heard, like it's just really, really interesting seeing women's place in all of this, and how I guess Australia has adopted the judicial process of the UK.
Oh, very much, very much. There's some, especially with different criminal justice processes and ideas, there was certainly exchange between the US and and Australia, but I think Australia historically has been very UK focused. I think that the gentleman that built Gladstone Jail, I actually have a note here about it. He went over and met with the governor of Bristol Bristol Jail to come up with a plan reflecting what was best practice in the UK.
Okay.
Thank you very much for answering my question.
Thank you for that. We have a question from Emily Rose Hay, and then we're going to go to Robert. Emily, did you want to read your question? I think we might have lost Emily. Okay, so she says, this is something that I'm actually quite interested to hear as well. She says, to thank you for the research and the presentation, Alison. She says, could you speak a little bit more about the exercise about retrying Elizabeth McGee? And I actually want to tack an adjacent question onto that. How do we avoid presentism in this kind of exercise?
Yeah, I think that with McGee, we might actually just like really lean into the presentism. I think that, so one of my colleagues is involved with the Feminist Judgment Project. I'm not sure if any of you have heard of this, but it's essentially looking at different judgments and rewriting them as if it had been written by a feminist. And so we're actually thinking about retrying this as sort of a feminist, like a feminist judgment project of, and see where it takes us. I mean, certainly the case is very, very complex. It reads, when I read the transcripts from the court, it seems like the judge did not think that this should have been a capital offense, that it probably should have been a lesser charge, but the jury did not feel that way. I think in terms of the standards of the time, that this wouldn't be considered a miscarriage of justice. But yeah, we're just, I think that we're not going to retry it in its historical context. We are going to, I think, completely lean into, we're approaching this like it is 2025 and this has happened. How are we doing it? Yeah, that's how we're going to tackle that beast.
Okay, thank you for that. That's certainly one way to just redress, you know. I'll hand the floor over to Robert. I think he had his hand up.
Sorry, Rosemary, I couldn't quite hear you. Can I ask a question? Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry. Hi, Alice. Thanks. Just a quick question, I think, that relates to sort of the overarching theme of your talk, which is sort of women's engagement and participation in the criminal justice system. And we just mentioned these all-female juries that have a long history. You're obviously talking about women watching other women in prison in colonial Australia. I was just wondering, because if I heard you correctly, you said that it was not a voluntary choice by women to go and work in these prisons. They were made to work in those prisons. Because that's quite interesting. Please go on.
Oh, just to clarify, the matrons, or are you asking if the matrons had a choice?
Yes. What about the matrons themselves? Did they choose to be there, or were they forced to?
Look, I mean, that's sort of a tough one to untangle. I'm not sure. I had assumed that they wanted to work in that role, but I do know that at least one, Henrietta, she did try to apply for a matron's position at a hospital. So when I saw that, I did think maybe she wasn't completely satisfied in this role and wanted to do something different. She wasn't successful in that application. Yeah, I'm not, I mean, I assumed they had some autonomy in making that choice because, but I'm not sure how I could track that one down actually.
If I can, because if you let me finish the question, maybe that's going to help you.
Yeah,
So
sorry, yeah,
what I'm
sorry.
trying to, no, please. What I was trying to figure out is to what extent sort of carceral feminism is actually something that was invented by men in a way. So getting women involved in materially running and administering and managing the criminal justice system, whether that's sort of an imposition. In other words, women being sort of domesticated into doing this kind of carceral work.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you sort of had any thoughts on that.
What
And if there were any resistance to it by women that did not want to be involved in, working in these carceral spaces.
yeah, no, I think that I'm sure that there were large portions of the female population that had no interest in working in these spaces, full stop. There are a lot of records from like the Women's Temperance League that are calling for paid position for women in police stations. And a lot of them are saying, look, we see that women successfully work in jails, like we should have them also working in lockups because we don't want men sort of touching women and doing these things. So I think that there were certainly vocal groups that wanted women working in these spaces. There was a lot of concern by women that if women weren't working in that space, that men would be physically searching women, that there might be conduct that occurs that's unacceptable. And so there was certainly a push that's quite well documented by women's suffrage groups, women's temperance leagues, those types of things that wanted women working in this space, to the degree that I think in South Australia, they actually offered to put up the salary for a position for a police matron to work at a lockup. And there's documents that support that in Australia, and I've seen them in the US and the UK as well. But I think with any of these shifts that occur when women are moving into new spaces, I mean, there's certainly that potential that it can be co-opted. And there's certainly going to be lots of women that have different ideas about how they want to spend their time and participate in different aspects of society. But I think it does get complex, as you mentioned, when it's these husband and wife teams. And certainly with like the research that I've seen for police matrons, there was that implicit assumption that the wife would just want to do that work. That of course she'd want to care for children that came to the police station. Of course she'd want to be the one searching the women, like that's what she wants to do. It's her natural feminine mothering self. And there was probably plenty of women in that space that had no desire to go and pat down someone or tend to another lost child when they have 6 kids at home that are already crying. So yeah, thank you. I think that's a really important question that I do need to think about a bit more.
Thank you, Alice.
Thank you for that. Some very interesting questions. I have just to build on that, this idea of our questions or queries or curiosities about the fate of women in those spaces in this time. I was interested in understanding something about that joint effort between husband and wife. So when you noted that there were 2 quarters, that there was a quarters for the matron, which she didn't occupy if she was married to the guard figure, say. So was she paid?
She was paid, but and she was paid at the matron's rate, but the matron's rate was much lower than the keeper's salary. And I actually I had a document that I meant to print out to share the difference. But it was drastically different, those pay rates. But she was getting paid. And at this time in Australia, police matrons were maybe getting paid on like a piecemeal basis, but no sort of set salary. So this was a sort of a big step for women, I think, working in the criminal justice system, that even though they were an extension of the husband, there was a recognition that their work was also existing independently and performing different roles than what he was doing.
Okay. Excellent. You've given us a lot of food for thought here. Actually, I don't know if I'm overlooking anyone who might have another question. So I'm going to take I don't see any hands up. I'm going to take the chair's prerogative and delve a little bit more this idea of cycling in and out. We talked about what was the evidence for this in terms of recidivism rates for these women?
Sure, it was essentially just seeing them coming in and out of the log. So both in the log book, and it was, I mean, a lot of the offenses were these small offenses. So disorderly conduct, drunkenness, not having means to support themselves. So some of that would have been almost, in Australia at least, sort of code for prostitution. And so it was regulating morality in many ways. So they might come in for, some of them were drunkenness, you might only be in for 2 weeks, then you go back out, and then you might be back in a month for disorderly conduct, which might be a month sentence, and then you're back out again and moving through in this way. There was one other, Elizabeth had sort of the longest sentence for murder. There was one other woman who was serving a similar sentence, who I'm still doing the background research on. But this was a case that got a lot of attention in the newspaper because she got pregnant outside of wedlock, and she took her child to the beach and essentially let the tide come in. And so she was there for a long time as well. She was one of the other sort of long-time residents at Gladstone. But a lot of it was, it's the same names, similar offenses that all sort of sit in that same arena of essentially being poor.
Yeah, I'm struck by this because there was also mention of the children and what the children would do on a daily basis. So to what extent did the prisons, as they were then, serve as a social services? Because we now talk about how prisons are social services, that effectively the funding that should go into social services are going into policing. Yeah. So how do you see this, what is that? Is there a link that's linked to this history?
Oh, definitely. I really saw that very clearly. And that's why I started to wonder about why we saw the drop in inmates in the 1890s, because I didn't know if maybe they started funding social welfare in a different way. Yeah. So people were maybe doing the same things, but being funneled to different services, essentially, rather than the criminal justice system. But Gladstone Prison actually, around the maybe 1900s, it started getting criticized in the press because people felt like it was becoming essentially a hospital for offenders. They didn't like that it was getting all these people in that had disabilities and couldn't sort of work and do what the public thought they should be doing in prison. You see that in these logs with the matrons trying to figure out, an inmate got injured at a different prison, so they transferred her to Gladstone. And what are they supposed to do with her now? Because she's supposed to work and she can't. And so they're definitely working as another sort of social safety net. In the 1920s, Gladstone has a really interesting history. They converted it to essentially an oversized drunk tank, but they were trying to address not a drunk take, that's not the right word for it, like maybe a rehab facility. So they would pay people that were habitual drunks to go to Gladstone. And if you completed a treatment program, they'd pay you at the end. So they'd pay you sort of £10 to go there. If you completed a month-long program, you'd get paid £26 at the end of it. So they did try to do these sort of different programs. To try to address these issues that they were seeing in the society. That one didn't particularly work. And again, I haven't looked at that period quite as much, but the public sentiment was we shouldn't be paying people to to go to and dry out and have this like vacation at the jail and then get £26 and come back. And especially if they started drinking again, then it became evidence that none of these programs work and that we shouldn't be doing it, which, yeah, it feels incredibly familiar, I have to say.
I was going to say, and you could see like the pushback against what we think of as rehabilitation. So I know ultimately when you really delve into the histories of these institutions, you see that rehabilitation is quite patronizing and quite detrimental, and at its core had a lot of retributive practice built in, even though it wasn't called that. But certainly, like when I as in listening, I kept thinking about, okay, so how did the children fare? Like, were their fates tied to their mother's incarceration? And certainly because there was that threat of poverty, how could they avoid not being tied to their parents' fate? I don't know how much of that research intersected with, like, that question intersects with your research here.
Yeah, I did trace Elizabeth's children because they were all sent to the destitute asylum, and they had quite thorough records in terms of what they experienced there. Her two youngest ones, they didn't survive. They didn't get the care they needed, or for whatever reason didn't make it. So that was James, and then her next oldest one. And the other ones had really rough experiences. You know, they were apprenticed out, and then there's notes that they went and did a wellness check, and the people that had sort of done the pseudo adoption wouldn't let them check on the children. And then the note is never let children come to this house again. But many of Elizabeth's children did end up growing up and being productive, non-offending people. One of her sons did have run-ins with the law when he was younger, but seemed to age out of crime like most people do. And her husband Patrick, he essentially offended until he died after he got out of jail. But her children did okay, and that's sort of when I was crying about her little ones not making it, I had to console myself and say, look, most of them experienced something absolutely horrific, incredibly difficult lives, and they managed to come out on the other side. So
yeah, absolutely. I think that the emotional toll of this historical research cannot be overstated. That these might have been people in the past, but we see replications within the present, and it's hard not to sort of get choked up, because you think, okay, this is not these are not events that we can consign to history. They are part of they're built into what's happening today in our contemporary. Thank you so much for sharing this really interesting set of ideas with us. I don't see any other questions. And I want to thank you both the audience and you for joining today. It's currently 11 o'clock where you are, 11 p.m. guys.
11:30, yep.
So thank you for taking the time. We really, really do appreciate it. And as some people have noted, the session is being recorded. And because it's taken so long to put together the website, I've been sending out the talks to the presenters, and eventually I will get the talks to the attendees as well. Guys, send me an email if you'd like me to forward you the recording. I don't want to plug your inboxes up with unnecessary messages. So let's give Alice a round of applause. Let me find the function here for myself. Yeah. This was really, really interesting. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, I've been so excited about it, and I was really worried that Yeah, in a prison, people are like, well, what are you going on about?
No,
So
no,
thank you
no.
so much for your questions and energy and excitement. It makes me really excited to keep working on the project.
Please keep going. There's a lot there to unearth. I mean, certainly like this history is so hidden, and the idea of women being barred after the service is professionalized because it became too important work, that the work was deemed too important for them to do, even though they originated and their efforts built the system. It's very much an erased history that's worth putting back into play. Okay, folks, it's now lunchtime, so enjoy your lunch. Alex is going to go to bed.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great night or day.
You take care, yeah?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. You want to stick around for a moment?